My request everybody to please put yourselves on mute, preferably also your videos off so that it doesn't distract from the experience. And may I also request you to please type in your questions in the chat and I shall take them at the end of the presentation. All right, Ritusha, over to you.
Thank you, Jabin, and thank you for that glowing recommendation that you had for me. It's always a pleasure to be a part of Institute of Chinese Studies, and especially I'm really looking forward to this session with you chairing and so many of my colleagues, contemporaries, as well as teachers attending the session, so that one can expect a very authoritative comment on the kind of research that I'm embarking upon. This is a piece that I'm trying to sort of develop. It is indeed more than halfway through, and it's in a series of arguments that I'm trying to make in terms of looking at how the content from media is affecting foreign policy decisions. And as we've all been grappling with a barrage of media reportage on India-China relationship, on in general the news regarding pandemic, and indeed the news regarding anything and everything under the earth, under the sky, we have to sort of see how that news affects our decision making. My point of interest, of course, is how much does it impact the foreign policy decisions of different actors involved. And this is a small attempt in that kind of direction. So I'm going to share my screen now and begin with my presentation. Yeah. Is it all right?
Yes, Ritusha.
Yeah,
you can see this.
The title is China's Image War, a comparative study of select newspaper coverage on the origin of COVID-19 virus. What we see on the screen is it's in front of all of you, and this is not an orange, and it's an image of an orange. So on a very light note like that, we just begin studying foreign policy. The first question that arises, of course, is why should we actually look at what does image mean in foreign policy? And in the current context of the COVID-19 pandemic worldwide, there's been a lot of debate surrounding the origin of the virus, and the various gaps actually in that sense regarding the information with respect to its origin and the spread have led to a kind of a very, very dubious situation for China, because the pandemic arose from there. For decades, China has been building an image of a rising power, and the varying nature of the kind of power that it can wield over various decisions with regards to world politics have been debated in many instances. Now, how does, in that sense, in that reference of image, how does image building help China? There are many theories from the IR theories, basically, which inform this kind of image building, and they help us understand the importance of image building in terms of foreign policy in general and decision makings in particular. Now, image theory has been understood as a very important and a very promising means to study both foreign policy and international relations, and sometimes the idea of cognition has been very important in terms of major foreign policy decisions of the last century. So through the study of images, we've seen that various models of foreign policy decision makings have benefited themselves, and some of those which I have underlined here are with regards to rational information processing, recognition of cognitive biases that one may have in terms of the images that one builds of other actors, various types of reasoning and information processing, and finally optimizing the kind of choices that one may make regarding the decision making in foreign policy. However, there are many limitations of this, and the first limitation is, of course, the idea of the subject's own perception. That is, the one who's making the foreign policy decision makers construct of a subject, the other subject. And then, of course, the multiple factors that hinder a very clear image formation. And the final one, which is a very big limitation, is the difficulty to identify the operational indicators that may link the image formation and finally the decision-making process. There are many seminal works in this regard. If you look at the IR stalwarts like Holsty, Jervis, and all, and I've tried to include a holistic list of, survey of literature there. We have a huge plethora of image and the importance of image theory in terms of foreign policy. Now, taking a cue from that and building upon that tradition of image formation and the study of images, I basically look at, I have two objectives, two very specific objectives in this particular paper. One is to basically analyze the news coverage in the two Western dailies and two Chinese dailies, all four in English, regarding the stories that are carried out in these four dailies with respect to virus's origin since the pandemic outbreak. And the second one is to compare the framing and agenda setting of this kind of a reportage and the kind of impact that this reportage has on China's image construction. The methodology is a bit elaborate in that sense, and I hope that that helps us to that I would have more comments in this regard at the end of the session. The first one is, of course, the medium chosen, the online edition of four newspapers: the New York Times, which is paper N1, the Guardian N2, People's Daily N3, and the Global Times N4. And the criteria for their inclusion is in terms of the Western newspapers: global coverage, liberal newspapers, credible journalism. For New York Times specifically, this is a newspaper in the US with worldwide influence and readership. In the US, it is the second largest paper by circulation. In case of The Guardian, this is a British news daily and reaches more than 23 million UK adults each month. And as we speak, these estimates are actually quite revised during the pandemic, where the print circulation has actually gone down, but online circulation has increased in the case of The Guardian. On the other hand, we have the Chinese newspaper. I'm looking at the papers with biggest circulations. People's Daily, Renmin Rapao, is the largest newspaper group in China, published worldwide with a circulation of over 3 million. It is actually called the official voice of the Central People's Government and the CPC Central Committee. It provides direct information on the policies and viewpoints of the CPC. The second paper, or the N4 in this particular paper, is the Global Times, which is a daily Chinese newspaper under the People's Daily newspaper, and features international issues, it is known to have a very strong nationalist hue, known for also a very populist strategy towards journalism, has an inclination to court controversy. The genre that I have actually chosen is the opinion pieces, interviews, and editorials. The criteria for inclusion of these genre is actually the articles, interviews, or editorials that carry the stories or have a strong reference to the origin of the virus. Date range is basically decided after I had a look at what I had from N1 till N4, and the date range in that regard is March 2020 to June 2021. Actually, I should revise it to July 2021 because the parameters as we spoke have changed, and I'll just tell how they changed. Now, the most important bit of this paper is the sampling biases that I carry. The newspapers that I have selected range from a different, they have a different range in terms of the kind of perspectives that they are known to carry. From the US and UK, we have a healthy mix of left to liberal to centrist positions in terms of the New York Times and the Guardian. On the other hand, we also have from China the two papers, People's Daily and Global Times. People's Daily is primarily conservative, but is known to have a kind of liberal position on many issues. Global Times, on the other hand, is, as I said, is known for its nationalist hues, has a very aggressive kind of journalistic attitude towards its coverage of global affairs. The other sampling bias that is there is I have taken the top 10 news stories that appear in the main domain of the websites of all of these four newspapers. The items analyzed are actually in terms of just the text-based items, and I did not include audio-visual broadcast that may have been telecast on the newspaper's website. The keyword is COVID virus origin. So when you look at N1, N2, N3, N4 main domains, basically you punch in COVID virus origin, and then you see the kind of reports that sort of display. The top 10 displays are usually the top 10 most read stories with regards to those keywords. But I'll make a distinction when it comes to reading the Western source and reading the Chinese source. The New York Times and the Guardian are supposed to represent the Western perception here. So that's the other kind of sampling bias that is present in this research. Now, I'll briefly look at top 10 headlines on the origin of the COVID virus, COVID-19 virus. Now, the first slide that you can see in this regard is from the New York Times. And if you briefly have a look at the top 10 stories, these are, of course, in terms of the stories that have gained maximum traction. So the story which is at the top, December 6, 2020, is regarding China peddling falsehoods to obscure origins of COVID-19 pandemic. Now, if you look at closely, and I'm going to do the content analysis in a bit, but if you just look at the headlines from the New York Times, the top 10 headlines, most of them have a direct reference to the origin of COVID virus and the ambiguities which are supposedly around it. And the need to investigate in that sense is very highly recommended in these headlines for the readers. So this December 6th story is the top story from New York Times. And I must also make a small reference here to the number of stories that actually appeared. So one has not really looked at all of those stories, but for the New York Times, it was 720 stories that got displayed with this particular keyword, COVID-19 virus origin. So, and we're going to compare this with the kind of with the numbers that appeared for either the Guardian or the People's Daily or finally the Global Times. So again, very briefly looking at the kind of top stories, WHO is one of the references. US and Biden and the foreign policy in that sense of the US is a very big reference in terms of these top headlines. These headlines set the agenda in that sense, in terms of who is investigating, who is supposed to investigate, and who is raising the conscience of the world, as it were, with regards to the origin of the virus. Now, if we move on to the next paper, which is The Guardian, if you look at the other 10 headlines in that sense, again, now it's a mixed bag. It's not really referring to the foreign policy of the United Kingdom per se. It's not really putting the onus of finding out the ambiguities and truths about the virus on the United Kingdom. It is generally just informing the readers in terms of there being biases, there being doubts, and there being certain opacity of information with regards to COVID-19 origin. Now, there is a lot of reference to United Nations. There is a lot of reference to the US. There is also a reference to G7, how there is a lab leak theory, and how the onus lies on China to clarify on certain, doubts that the world has at large with this is very much displayed here. Now, okay, something. Okay. So now if we look at People's Daily, and we can contrast them in terms of the top 10 headlines that appear here. People's Daily, and I forgot to mention one detail about The Guardian in that sense. The number of stories that appear actually with those keywords are 8,080. And it might just increase as we speak. So the numbers might just increase there. So we can see the volume of information and the volume of news coverage that The Guardian is actually doing. The difference with respect to the coverage from the New York Times is that the New York Times is setting the agenda directly, not really bringing in other countries, making references to United Nations and WHO in a few stories, but at the same time locating this onus of dialogue between US and China with regards to the origin firmly within the US. And that's a very interesting thing to look at in terms of the top stories in the New York Times. In contrast, the Guardian has actually been repeating or many a times retelling the stories that have already been there, from major media outlets from the US with regards to the origin of the virus. Now, coming to People's Daily, we have these top 10 headlines. And if we look at these headlines carefully, the origin of the COVID-19 is actually, referred to not directly in all of them. So there is also the onus of honest assessment on US with regards to pandemic response, with regards to how the pandemic is looked at world over. And the way US is probing into COVID-19 origin is basically vilifying China, is stigmatizing China, and is akin to a kind of, you know, discrimination, which is reminiscent of the last century of humiliation. That kind of, but in a milder tone, these kind of stories are, carried out by the People's Daily. And there is also a lot of reference to experts' comments and opinions, which counter this perception by the West. I've actually deleted or omitted two particular stories. One is three, in fact, three particular stories, because they did not refer to the origin of the virus. At the same time, when I punched in these keywords, these stories appeared in within the top 10 category. These stories were actually how the Malaysian, Prime Minister talked about the best role that China has played, the most cooperative role that China has played in terms of handling the pandemic. The second one is about China and Russia having forged an agreement to sort of cooperate over the pandemic, management. And the third one is a story by Kishore Mahbubani, where he says that basically for Biden, the threat is not China, but the threat is located within the US. And Trump and his supporters is what he's referring to. So those are the three stories which I omitted from top 10, but they appear nonetheless on the website. And that's very telling, because it's somehow, telling us that China is trying to bring in a lot many factors so far as the spread of COVID virus is concerned, in terms of its origin, the tracing, the agenda setting as to who investigates, who's allowed to investigate, for whom is it beneficial, and if there is any kind of discrimination that is being actually acquired at the outset, what are the reasons behind it. And now, in contrast, if you look at Global Times, one of the most interesting things that happened in terms of Global Times was that when I punched in COVID-19 virus origin, the keyword, only one single story showed. And that story was Indian media shows double standards in smearing China on virus origin, as the government opposes India variant. So that story, which was carried out on May 23rd, 2021, was the single response that came up from the Global Times. So for this particular paper, I had to change my keywords for N4, and the keywords that then which yielded more results were actually COVID-19 virus origin. So I had to slightly change the sequence of the keywords, and then I came up with these. I didn't have to do this for the rest of the three newspapers. So here then we see that the way China has been portrayed is China is ready to help India and other South Asian countries fighting COVID-19. It's interesting to see that India does figure in the top 10 news items by the Global Times on this particular, on this particular issue. And how there is invocation of science, how the world insights basically, obviously there's a reference to the US in terms of its role, its willingness to basically carry out an honest assessment of the virus origin theories. Investigations with regards to the COVID-19 cases, their origin, their initial cases, and why and how the WHO sponsored studies and hypotheses need some more closer scrutiny. Now, looking at all of these 40 headlines, the interesting thing that happens is one can actually come to certain summative assessments. And I'm going to focus first on the keywords and the contents around that. Now, if we just count the keyword origin of virus across the sample text, so it may be COVID-19 virus origin, or it may be COVID virus origin, or origin of the virus. So these three variants, but keywords remain similar in that nature. Across the sample texts actually revealed that the news items in N1 and N2, which is the New York Times and the Guardian, directly referred to these keywords in the headlines, as well as used it repeatedly in the main body of the text. Further, it was seen that N1 was setting the agenda in terms of highlighting the ambiguities with respect to information regarding the origin of the virus. The sample text from N2 referred mostly to the doubts around China's claims, and also referred to the US in terms of its responsibility in setting the story right, as it were, and also carrying out further investigations, finding out the truth about the virus, and also setting the future agenda as to what kind of dialogue then can be forged with China in this regards, how its responsibility can be fixed. All of that was actually within the US, within the purview of the US foreign policy, and the Guardian made a very strong point of that. Now, in comparison, if you look at the text samples from N3, they refer to the keywords with certain oblique references, as I highlighted earlier. And they were focusing mostly on the aspects of cooperative measures by China in terms of managing and containing the pandemic. In contrast, the final text samples from N4 basically critiqued the Western conspiracy or US conspiracy, and they also pointed out towards the tendency to vilify China in terms of negating all its efforts in a very in what it considers to be a very efficient management of the pandemic. Now, interpretation of underlying context from this this analysis, this content analysis, is basically three. COVID-19 pandemic has provided an opportunity for China to boost its image in the area of global coverage with regards to the news about China and the virus. The international news reportage from other countries throughout the last year have actually been, the international news reporting from the country within China has been very, very positive. And also its collaborative efforts with the news agencies from outside China have also been amped up. And there's been a lot of there's been a lot of persuasive inclusion of news items regarding this positive image of China. And so if you look at what Global Times and People Daily basically would have in their top 10 news, not just with regards to this particular keyword, but also in general regarding the COVID-19 pandemic and China's role in that, they would borrow stories from other news agencies and replicate them. And these stories that were borrowed from other news agencies were also very much towing the line, or were actually in consonance with what China had given as official statements. So there was a lot of replication of news with regards to the way China would on a certain issue related to pandemic. The media outlets in the West, the newspapers in question here, are seen as pushing back against the influence that China might have sort of, wielded in terms of its positive role in handling the pandemic. And China's attempts at positive image construction are also seen as being pushed back by these stories within the samples taken N1 and N2. So there is a visible trend towards a very assertive and proactive strategy in terms of content sharing agreements with other countries, news agencies on the part of China, and sharing, of course, news and replicating those stories, amplifying those stories that help boost China's positive image. So many times Global Times would carry forward stories of other newspaper outlets or other broadcast networks, and just amplify the positive stories from across the world with regards to China's role. So what emerges in the in the middle of these two kind of image constructions of China is, of course, a lovable China. And on the one hand, which she referred to in the month of June, early June, he referred to the fact that China needs to have a more have a better capacity to communicate with the world. A more lovable image of China needs to emerge, and uh, so keeping in mind that kind of a strategy of communicating with the rest of the world and constructing a very positive image, Chinese news outlets and N3 and N4 in this particular case are seen to be carrying that kind of mandate for themselves, and putting in the perspectives that is required for a lovable China. Now, the unreliable China, on the other hand, the image construction of this sort is basically coming from different media outlets from the West, and the media coverage worldwide has basically been casting a shadow of doubt on all of those attempts by China to build a positive image. And it continues to unravel underlying ambiguities in China's claims with regards to not just the management of the pandemic, but also the beginning of it, as it were, the origin of the virus. And the continuous positing of China as the other in world politics, which basically is, the image of, and we'll come to that later, the image of a person that you identify as other, or the subject that you identify as the other, inevitably then superimposes itself as the image of the enemy. And this kind of a clash between the news reportage from China and from outside China, from Western media particularly, is leading to an active image war for China. And there are significant ramifications of it. Applying image theory, it's possible to look at this scenario of clashing reportage and clashing image building in that sense as leading to an increase in the threat subject perceives from another actor, that is judged that can be judged in and compared in terms of capability and culture, and it can be associated with an increase in the resemblance between the subject's observation of that actor and the stereotypical enemy image. Now, the effect or emotional charge of threat or opportunity that is felt by the subject will correspond to the kind of strategic policy choices on either sides. So if we look at this proposition from image theory, from what we understand of image theory, we know that the significant ramifications in this regard would mean that this image war escalation will actually happen in future. There is going to be an argument and counter argument with regards to where the onus of the origin of the virus lies. And the impact of this escalation in image war is going to simply lead to more stereotypical othering of China in world politics, where China tries to construct a self which is positive, a self which is cooperative, a self which is reliable, responsible. That kind of a self is going to be counterposed by the image of the other that the Western media has been in a sense building for China. And this other is unreliable, is duplicitous, is non-cooperative, is aggressive, more assertive. And all of those adjectives which are used to sort of, nullify the image of a lovable China are going to feed into this stereotypical image construction of an enemy. So I'm going to stop here, and I don't know how much time I've taken, but I'm going to wait for the comments from the chair and also the comments from the audience as well as questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Ritusha. I mean, you're dot on time, 30 minutes, just under 30 minutes, in fact. So excellent. All right. So, ladies and gentlemen, I think we've been treated to a very detailed and measured presentation. Ritusha was meticulous in terms of outlining her methodology, declaring clearly what the sample is, what the sample biases were. And this is a micro study. I think it's something that is extremely necessary, because if you think about it, clearly the Chinese have done this sort of a study. examining what the foreign media, Western, including as well as media from elsewhere, other parts of the world, how this media is actually portraying China, the virus origins, as well as China's responses. And they are tailoring their response, their media strategy accordingly. I think there's one very important point that sort of comes out almost as an aside, which is about content sharing, how the Chinese have published their versions, entire full pages sometimes of the China Daily and so on in foreign media. So this is, and some of these same newspapers, including the New York Times, in fact, have not been shy about publishing such Chinese propaganda in their press. And we in India have also seen how seriously the Chinese ambassador takes the job of publishing regularly in Indian media outlets, to try and push their point of view on any number of things. Now, in terms of questions, I think there can be two kinds of questions. One related directly to the presentation itself, which is an academic presentation in substance. You could ask questions about in terms of methodology, the content, unexamined questions, perhaps the issues at the heart of this presentation in terms of interpretation or the completeness of survey and so on. Or the other set of questions is, which I suspect is also likely to come up, is going to be about the origins of the pandemic, of the virus itself. Now, that really is not been Ritusha's objective here. Though, Ritusha, if one or two of these questions come up, I'm going to ask you to address them. I'm sure you can do that as well. So let me just kick off the questions, perhaps maybe raise one or two issues, and then I'll throw it open to the audience. One, Ritusha, in terms of the sample, so you have the New York Times and the Guardian, which don't actually sort of coordinate with each other. But your Chinese sample, you clearly mentioned that the Global Times is really a subset or a subsidiary of the People's Daily. In a sense, you have these two English versions of Chinese newspapers, these are actually, they have specific content not to be sometimes found in the Chinese language versions. These two actually work in tandem. So how does that affect your, survey results is one question. Second, the search function in Chinese newspapers can be fixed, and especially search functions available to foreigners. You will probably see only those results that the People's Daily or the Global Times actually wants you to see, right? If you just look at the at some of the top headlines in the Chinese newspapers, you will find that it was the lab leak hypothesis, or the expression lab leak doesn't come so much in either the Guardian or the New York Times as often as it comes in the Chinese top 10. And this, in a way, and you saw the word expression for rhetoric in the United States also come up. So in a way, it's strange that on the one hand, the Chinese are trying desperately to deny there was a lab leak, but they are, in a sense, pushing this idea through their media of it having originated in a lab in the United States. Completely unfounded, but it's right at the top without any evidence, regularly and continuously in all these top headlines. So that's one thing about the search and the fixing of the match, as it were, on the Chinese side, and the impact on your results. Third, I'd like you to sort of explain a little bit more about what you meant when you said the People's Daily has both a liberal and a conservative sort of outlook or an approach in its pages. Because, this is for information of the audience, perhaps those who do not look at China full-time, who might have only one view of the People's Daily as a party mouthpiece, as something that is only engaged in propaganda, about how the People's Daily does, perhaps, at least domestically, perform much more of a function. Finally, in terms of a comment, a general comment, I mean, I take it that, I mean, I understand that lovable China is really the expression of the day as far as China's you know, outward image building is concerned. But there is an older expression, telling China stories well, which Xi Jinping repeatedly underlined over the last few years, especially since the last party congress. And this really, everything falls in as part of this telling China story well approach. And this has elements of both aggressive media management and strategizing, as well as much more gradual content sharing, buying out media space in foreign newspapers, television channels, and so on. So I will probably leave you to think about those, while I might take maybe one or two questions from the audience, and then you can sort of try and answer all of these together. All right, so there is a question from Mr. Nirmal Panda, who asks, and I will read this out for the benefit of the YouTube audience that we'll have later. Can we consider the Western media's reports, especially of American reports, on the origin of the virus as a kind of propaganda against rising China? All right, so the next question is rather long. So, Ritusha, why don't you tackle these sets of questions first while I get hold of the others?
Yeah, so I'll respond to your question, which is actually very important and also sort of refers to the methodology that has been taken for this particular paper, which is basically the usage of taking Global Times and People's Daily together as the sample texts coming from China, given the fact that Global Times is actually under, it's a subset of People's Daily. So the one, and it is also somehow, I'll try to address that question, how People's Daily is taking both liberal position in some instances, and also is primarily known as a conservative paper for the outside world. Now, conservative is in the sense that it is obviously the mouthpiece of the party, and it is carrying out the official stories of the party, which it wants to present to the world. So conservative in that sense of a regulation of the information coming out of China. Domestically, the kind of stories and items that People's Daily actually has or caters to is from various quarters, and might not necessarily just reflect the opinion of party. These domestic issues would range from all kind of quarters. The issues pertaining to gender, for instance, gender biases that are prevalent in the society, issues which are dealing with the environmental problems that China is facing head on, and many issues on which the statement of the party might not be already there, or may not, as the party may be in the progress or in the process of making a kind of opinion and putting it out for the citizens to sort of take it as the official position of the party. So all of those issues in the process of forming opinions, even those are catered to by the People's Daily in that sense. And the fact that it is the largest sharing largest circulation, this is the paper with the largest circulation after reference news actually. But then reference news is not something which is being read a lot by the outside world. People's Daily is the one which is actually the paper which is referred to when the global media outlets are looking for any kind of news emanating from China. So I did not use reference news in that particular context. And then, of course, there are papers with larger circulation over People's Daily, but then again, those papers are much lesser known to the outside world. So how the world also sees the construction of image by China, because the world is actually, or the Western media outlets are actually responding to the image construction of China in basically the English language, and in through those sources which are coming out of China as its communication strategies with the rest of the world. So as a part of its communication strategy, one of the most important newspapers is People's Daily. Now, why Global Times again? As I said, Global Times serves a very different kind of purpose. It may not really just take the position of the party. It is in that sense an extension where and China did not be on a back foot or may not use a very politically correct language to address a particular issue. So many a times we've seen Global Times quoting controversies in terms of using very aggressive language, or also being out on in a very attacking mode, handling certain issues, may not just play the very defensive back foot kind of a politically correct line that People's Daily might have. So between the People's Daily and the Global Times, they sort of handle the issue from two different extremes, as it were. One playing a very safe position and not really putting China out there in front, trying to answer all those questions with a very belligerent kind of attitude. Whereas Global Times has that kind of tendency, has that kind of mandate, has also, therefore, a lot of foreign scholars are also writing that, Global Times might have a very independent editorial board, because they don't need to really just adhere to party line in that sense. That is debatable, but I think it is sufficient to say that both the papers carry a different kind of mandate in terms of the stories that they uh, peddle out, or the stories that they write, and the perspectives that they put forth. So the selection of these two. Uh, of course, in case of the Western media, I deliberately chose the Guardian, even though it's, as I said, its print circulation had gone down. The Times could have been very well a choice, but then the online circulation of Guardian has gone up multiple times in during this pandemic. So the stories coming out from Guardian matter in that sense. And as I said, uh, and this is basically a black horse in that sense, because it is carrying out stories in unimaginable volume regarding the COVID virus origin. 8,000 stories. I mean, that's not something that you saw in New York Times or the People's Daily or the Global Times. I mean, the New York Times is limited to 700 plus stories, and this one is 8,000. So it's basically huge replication of the stories. So the stories are set, the agenda is set, the framing is done in major media outlets from the US, and those are then replicated by the Guardian. And then obviously these are being read and circulated very, very widely. And so there is a kind of connect, because one also has to see what is the origin of all of those top stories or all of those replicated stories. Most of them is actually from the news outlets based in the US. And and as I said, I mentioned that the foreign policy of UK is not something which is figuring out anywhere distinctively there. So I think the Guardian and the New York Times in that sense work very well together, in terms of the Guardian or similar news outlets allowing the news agencies from the US to set the agenda regarding this particular issue, and then amplifying it. So that's the kind of justification that I could think of. But of course, I mean, outside the scope of this immediate paper, if one looks at the longevity of such a research, I think there is a huge possibility there. And one could be looking at different media outlets from, say, Asia Pacific, particularly South Asia. I mean, how South Asia has responded to these kind of news. What is the version, the Western version, that the counterpart of the Western version here in South Asia or in Southeast Asia with regards to China's role in the pandemic and so on and so forth. So there is a sense of continuity that I think future research in this area might have with regards to this paper. Now, the question with regards to the Western media reportage being a kind of propaganda against rising China, as I said, that the agenda setting with regards to how you perceive a particular actor in world politics is something that is pursued very strongly by powers that be. So here we are talking about the US as a reigning superpower, if you will, which is definitely facing a lot of decline in many areas of its influence, be it economic or owing to different factors, its military outreach, overstretch, as the scholars have liked to point it, have pointed out in the past. And also the fact that there is this possibility of US giving into China in terms of yielding its position on various on various issues in terms of the supremacy that it exerts on those issues till now. So the fact that there is a kind of power transition that is expected between the US and China, and it might not be imminent, but it is certainly there in future in many areas. That is what is giving credence to this kind of competition between this image building. What the US needs to do for world politics, what it is doing, and what China is doing, how China is impacting the US's role, and this kind of overtone in various foreign policy pieces, the pieces that deal with opinions regarding foreign policy of the US, it's very much visible. Instead of simply putting it as us versus them story, it's more today the tone and tenor of such stories is about the world and the responsibility of another responsible actor, which is China. Now we know that the context of 2008, when there was a global subprime crisis, global crisis, which was actually pushed due to the subprime crisis in the US, and how there was this assertion by the global players to basically let China handle the recovery of the world in that sense, and the G7 meeting and the proposed G2 and whatnot, and the fact that China needs to come up with more, responsibility in terms of handling the economic growth quotient of the world while it's facing crisis which is emanated from the US. So that kind of background to how the US sees China's role in world politics as a kind of supportive role that China can play in terms of leading the world economy and so on and so forth.
Okay, Ritusha, we have a couple of, we have 3 long questions more, so maybe if you could just wind up with this one.
Yeah, so that kind of perception build up on either side gives rise to these kind of contradictory media reportage. So yeah.
Okay. All right. So we have a question from Matthew Hurst, who points out a contradiction in China's approach. I mean, on the one hand, we've all been talking about how China wants a lovable image, wants to tell a story well, etc. But on the occasion of the 100th anniversary of the party, we saw General Secretary Xi Jinping talk about China's enemies facing a wall of steel, getting their heads broken and whatnot. Now, of course, a lot of this was targeted at the domestic audience in China, right? There is contention that the language need not be interpreted. He spoke in Chinese, and that the Chinese translation, a direct translation into English, does not convey the same impact, or perhaps does not need to convey the same bloody image as the Western press has picked up on. So, but still, this is a problem that the Chinese have, which is, so he asks, do Chinese papers choose, so do you think that China is doing well in cultivating a lovable image or failing to do so? In a sense, why is that the case? It's probably a question. Do Chinese papers choose to represent a negative image of its historical enemies in the way you highlighted Western papers represent China? So in a sense, are Chinese papers reacting to the way the West looks at China by, some of their own negative portrayals of the West? And if the Western media focuses on negative stories, how exactly can China overcome this bias? So that's one question, one set of questions. Mr. Navneet Bhushan from the tech consultancy Graffiti from Bangalore actually has a question in terms of your presentation, which is, what are the key findings that are not in sync with your initial hypothesis? Were you sort of surprised by any of the findings at the end of your study, right? And well, this is a tough one. What is the overall view that emerges in terms of the actual truth about the origins of the virus? I think that's a tough one for anyone to answer. In any case, that was not your objective here. Finally, I'll take one question from Mr. Varun Sharma. I think this again goes back to the question of propaganda of the Chinese, but this is a slightly different question in that most media is now privately owned in the West, in India perhaps. but or it is state controlled, as in China, in Russia, for example, right? So there will inevitably be a bias that speaks either to state interests or to capital interests. Now, of late, I think what he's saying is that China is also catching up with Western media in terms of international presence, with China specifically establishing offensive propaganda against adversaries. So, uh, perhaps in connection to your previous question, perhaps would you like to add any more insights on this in terms of ownership of media, control of media, and China's growing presence? Yeah.
Yes. So I'll try to just because I have handled a similar question earlier. So I'm just gonna focus on the last question first and then come back to the previous two. The last question is pertaining to the kind of diversification of ownership that is there in terms of media outlets. The four media outlets across the world actually control most of the news. And outside of those four media houses, what we see is a growing presence of China news outlets, as it were. And if you just take the example of People's Daily, its circulation is very wide in terms of the countries that it covers. So the growing presence of China's news media outlets is a fact. Whether it's been able to use it as a very effective counter, propaganda towards, counter propaganda to set to acquire the agenda setting from the Western media outlets. I think that's yet to happen. Even in this case of origin of the virus, for instance, I think the agenda setting is very much in the hands of the Western media outlets. And what we see China doing and the Chinese media doing is responding to it, countering to it. It is not setting the agenda. The setting of agenda would have been where China could have, shown its success story in terms of dealing with the pandemic, without any kind of aspersions that are now associated with the origin itself. So if the entire problem is of one's own making, then the management of that problem is nothing to really sing about. That's what the Western media is today saying. So agenda setting is not clearly with China. And despite its growing media presence, growing footprint in terms of peddling out information and controlling information across the world, it is nowhere to the tune of what the Western media outlets have at their hand. So there is a kind of information asymmetry as so far as dissemination of information, and the origin of information and the agenda setting of the information is concerned. So I hope that partially answers the last question. The other two questions, the first one is basically about okay, um, there being a contradiction in terms of the attempts by China in the construction of this image. Even though the word that is being used in the chat box is mostly propaganda, I'm going to bring the focus back to the image construction. So, the lovable image on the one hand, and assertive and very steadfast, sturdy image of Chinese people on the other hand, are not necessarily contradictory in my mind, because if you look at Xi's speech on the 100th anniversary celebration, it's addressing the people of China, and people of China are supposed to have this nationalistic fervor in the mind of CCP to be able to posit themselves as worthy future leaders of the world. And the lovable China is not necessarily at odds with it, because nowhere in that position about lovable China, she yielded to the fact that China now needs to step down from this race of leadership. And I'm going to get back to my favorite the region and so on and so forth. China today has sort of started using that vocabulary more and more under Xi Jinping's leadership. The fact that they can actually lead, they can set an example. So earlier they were not doing that till Hu Jintao's time, but the fact that they can set an example for the rest of the world, and when they do that, they need to do it in a more communicative manner, in a manner which is more likable by others, but not necessarily any less assertive, or not necessarily any less leadership oriented. So that's very obvious from the tone and tenor of Xi Jinping's speech. Now, the aggressive brandishing of weapons, as it were, by Global Times and such, opinion makers from China, that's not really the official position. And I think what she was referring to in his speech, the latest speech, was actually a sense that there is going to be a rebuttal from China if the world gangs up against them. And by the world, of course, there is a reference to the age-old enemies in the sense of, propagandists against China's rise, the countries which are insecure in terms of yielding to China in global supremacy in different issues and so on and so forth. Navneet Bhushan's question with regards to whether there was a kind of surprise element in terms of initial hypothesis and the final findings. The final findings are actually telling us that there is an escalation of image wars, that there is an escalation of this othering of China in world politics, that there is an escalation of, stereotyping China again as the enemy. And when I say again, because there has been a period of bonhomie between the US and China. And today, when they are racing towards, this, when they are competing for so many influential sectors for supremacy in these sectors, it is obvious that there is going to be some kind of counter element to this bonhomie, and the pandemic has provided just that. This is an excellent opportunity for the US to sort of snatch back, the success story and its after effects from China, and set an agenda again for the world that is ready for US supremacy, for US leadership, because that is more responsible, that is more reliable. And China is not reliable because look what happened with the pandemic and so on and so forth. So this is an opportunity that the US foreign policy makers, the opinion makers, they are not going to let go of. So was there a disjuncture between the initial hypothesis and now? I don't think so. I mean, I did not really counter a null hypothesis in that sense. Just that what remains to be overseen is some very specific indicators which tell us what direction, tell us the streamlining, give us streamlining of the direction in which this whole, image war is going to proceed further. So maybe the specific indicators are missing as of now, and one has to work more on that. Am I audible? Okay, my screen is frozen. I can't hear anybody else.
We can hear you. I think John just dropped out.
Okay.
He's fixing it.
So if there are any more questions, I would be happy to answer.
Ritusha, why don't you take questions from chat box? While Jabin,
I have addressed those which are there in the chat box already. So till the last question I had addressed. In case there are any comments from you, sir, I would really appreciate that. Okay, so if there are no questions, then maybe, sir, you can take over and wind up. Okay, there's a question by Kannan Gopinathan. How much of Global Times coverage is in response to nationalistic demands from netizens there? Like the report says here, even the most nationalistic commentators of Global Times are trolled online for not being nationalistic enough. Okay, so yes, as we've seen a growing, section of the netizens across the world who are now giving their opinions in terms of all the issues, and all the issues pertaining to foreign policies usually, basically invite a lot of nationalistic, sentiments from the domestic population. So Global Times has also been criticized in terms of not answering aggressively and adequately enough to all of those comments about the negative comments about China and its role in the pandemic, or in general in world politics. And there has been a growing traction of netizens who basically criticize Global Times for not being aggressive enough. Having said that, a lot of those netizens actually represent, the they do represent the supporters of Global Times. So they are basically there to egg on such opinions and to justify the presence of such aggressive overtones in the opinion and editorial pieces of Global Times. Not necessarily originating as, not necessarily representing original or common thoughts from across the netizens in China, but may actually be paid by the Global Times to justify its aggressive tone and tenor. So that's one kind of corollary to that. There is a question by Professor Patricia Oberoi as to what are the parameters of this image building strategy vis-a-vis India in particular. Same as with regards to the West. Now, as I said, in this particular research, what I was looking at was the stories catering to the idea of the origin of the COVID virus, the COVID-19 virus. And Global Times, the search on Global Times revealed a very interesting, fascinating thing. The story regarding India was the top story. And in fact, that was the only story with that combination of keywords, as how the Indian government is showing double standards in terms of calling it the China virus on the one hand. I mean, not officially, but everybody in India seemed to have that kind of opinion. And that public opinion is gaining a lot of traction. That it is a China virus. On the other hand, the Indian government is basically opposing the usage of the term India variant. So how there is a double standard, and this was the top story from Global Times. So in that sense, in terms of its image building, I think the focus of its image building is not necessarily vis-a-vis India. It is interesting, in fact, to see that such a news story is actually gaining traction. That is perhaps because there has been a very recent, rise in the aggression on border between India and China. And keeping in mind that kind of a role that China thinks India is playing against it, this kind of a story appeared. But not much of an image building is done keeping in mind the role of India in South Asia. I think much of it has to do with what China has been doing with Southeast Asia, with Central Asian countries, and with its partners and allies in the African continent. So that kind of bonhomie solidarity, cooperative measures by China are highlighted. Its success story in South Asia is not something that is very much feeding into this image building, this positive image building by China itself. So they don't really highlight too much of a South Asian stories in their global communications. So India does not necessarily figure in there. Okay, another question by Professor Partha Mukhopadhyay. What would be the effect of action in Hong Kong on Apple Daily on the ability of China to tell its story well? Of course, Hong Kong is something that again represents a very star note, as it were, in terms of this image building, positive image building for China. And the second part of that question is, are individual reporters and columnists trolled in the social media, or is it mostly the publication? Yes, there is a lot of fair amount of trolling that happens in social media. And in fact, if you read the comments below some of those English, translations and dailies, they are vetted. So it's not, the English version is not really giving you much of a insight into what's the reaction of the netizens with regards to a particular story. But if you go to the Chinese version, and if you take the pains of somehow translating it and reading it and also looking at the comment section, then it's a very different world altogether. The reactions that may have been invoked, because it's not necessarily censored. The perception that is there that everything is censored, I don't really agree to it. There are key words that the party looks at, and they may be censored, but in general you do get a very open picture of the debate that a particular news item might have generated, unless it runs into a very sensitive stream of keywords that the party has for itself. Then it's not censored. So yeah, and we have our chair back, so in case he wants to decide which questions I
yeah,
ask.
sorry about that. Yeah, internet, online, that's the thing. So as I understand it, we have about 5 minutes left in the regular session or regular programming, but I'm gonna. So there's a sort of a mixed bag of questions. One goes as far away as the RCEP, whether India lost by joining RCEP. Now, I think we'll sort of have to pick and choose now. I think Dr. Priya Suresh's question is of whether China in one way or the other has used media to mislead the world with its own COVID narrative. I think that's more or less been answered. In fact, China is not the only one that does this misleading. But there's also this question by Arpana Raj on, do you think India is not important for China's image building process? What tools are the Chinese government applying for construction of a positive image in India? So Ritusha, okay, let me take one or two more questions. So from Professor Patricia Oberoi, Ritusha, you seem to suggest that the PD and GT represent a Chinese official view. But can one say that the New York Times and Guardian represent the official views of their respective national governments in the same sense? Colonel Venkat has a question. Okay, there's a question from the YouTube channel from Mr. Karthikeya Gupta. He wants to know, why does our large media, I suppose the Indian large media groups, invest so poorly in reporting China's socio-political affairs despite it being a prime strategic rival? I think that's a business money question, but all right. So you have a set of questions here, Ritusha, and I will leave it to you to pick and choose on what you want to answer. And since we need to sort of wrap it up, perhaps another 5 to 7 minutes.
Yeah. So very quickly, in response to Professor Oberoi's question, yes, most of the time PD and GT are actually representing the official party narrative on a particular issue. And of course, with respect to COVID, the origin of the COVID virus, this can be said more or less to be the official view that the two are actually telling us. With respect to NYT and the Guardian, yes, they are not representatives of the official views of their respective national governments. At the same time, the narrative that they pitch forth have a very strong overtone of US foreign policy, being the the prime location, the prime vantage point, as it were, for setting any kind of discussion around these issues. So I would not classify them as nationalistic in that sense, but the supremacy that they allot to US foreign policy vantage point is very obvious. And they may not represent the official version. At the same time, they can be actually considered the most important opinion makers in that sense. And it is a fact that most of the scholars and media outlets that have been looking at, and which is why I chose a left to center or liberal newspaper, the New York Times in that sense, and not really taking up, very nationalistic or aggressive, necessarily making China to be the enemy in that sense kind of newspapers and media outlets. So even here we saw that there was a strong vilification of China with regards to its role in the origin of the virus. Even in these liberal non-official outlets, there was a strong image construction, which of course goes on to feed into this whole narrative of China being the other. So despite taking left of the liberal or centrist, news items or newspapers and covering those stories, it's very obvious that even this corresponds to the kind of enemy image that is there in the offing for China for a few years to come, I feel. And that's the kind of justification that I can think of, trying to diversify my options from at least the Western sources and not taking those which are really going to just take a very aggressive foreign policy stance. Now, in response to Aparna's question, India is not important for China's image building process so far as China is trying to communicate to the world. China may not want to necessarily, highlight its troubles with India in that sense. So India-China border is not something that they want to really internationalize. They don't want to put forth this whole trouble they have with their immediate neighbor in terms of the border. So we have never seen that kind of India-centric positioning of China's responses to the world. That has never happened, even though that has happened on our part. I mean, we have had a very China-centric or a Pakistan-centric, kind of narrative coming out of our foreign policy, foreign policy opinions, whether at the levels of at the level of the leaders or at the level of scholars or policymakers in that sense. But that has never been the case with China. So whether India is important for image building process so far as their bilateral is concerned, I mean, they do what they do in other countries. I mean, they would like to carry out their opinion and editorial pieces in our major national dailies. They would like to put forth their arguments, and they would like to put their part, or pitch their part of the picture in our media outlets. But beyond that, there is not a very conscious effort to build a very positive image for themselves in India. Yeah. Last question from the...
On why Indian media does not invest in reporting.
Yeah, I think if we look at the coverage of foreign affairs in our media, I think it's dismally low, and it's gone down low to a huge extent in the last 1 decade or even 2 decades in that sense. And I think the focus of our media has been primarily domestic issues, domestic politics, and we've had a very inward looking kind of discourse unfolding in the last 1 decade. The context of foreign affairs is largely missing, and from that we can all, I mean, if you look at how much is South Asia, for instance, covered, it's not covered. We don't really have too much of a regional analysis in our national dailies in that sense. So why the media doesn't invest too much in China, the stories coming out from China, one, there is not many critical numbers who know China enough in India. I mean, this is a vicious structural loop of inefficiencies, inadequacies, and low investment in, area studies, specifically China studies. So there are not enough critical numbers who do international relations in the first place, and there are not enough critical numbers who do, China studies or specific area studies in on the second stage. So it's not really very difficult to see why we don't have a very authoritative, continuous discourse on various issues of foreign policy, specifically related to area studies. So, yeah.
All right. Thank you, Ritusha. I'm sort of going to wind this up in the next few minutes, but I'd like to highlight the fact that, Ritusha, a lot of people have said excellent and very good, and thank you for your presentation in the chat box. And I think everyone here will agree that we've heard some really good stuff. In conclusion, I just want to highlight that this set of questions that came in were actually quite important questions, including the one on India's place as far as China goes, China's image building goes, the question of Chinese media presence in South Asia, and our question of our investments in reporting and in foreign policy in general. I think Ritusha made a very important point that it's not just about China, but foreign policy in general faces very poor budgets or runs with very poor budgets in our media houses. There is an increase perhaps in English media reporting, but it seems to rely on foreign feed rather than sending your own reporters to the ground. I mean, I know that I grew up with The World This Week, Pranay Roy and Apan Menon, and we used to look forward to this once a week sort of thing. And it seemed that, okay, as India became a rising power or was a rising power, more and more interest would be developed in foreign affairs. But as Ritusha pointed out, I don't think that's exactly been the case. And even now, it took Ladakh and Galwan last year for people to now start paying greater attention to what China itself is doing. And again, that sort of attention is very limited to, We need a much more wider base of understanding. And to that end, this particular presentation of looking at Chinese newspapers and their strategies, the ways in which they present their news stories, etc., is very, very important. And I suspect that India will be a battleground as far as China's media as an image building is concerned, India and South Asia. And we will have even more interesting issues to deal with in terms of how China sets itself up against India in other South Asian countries. You look at just how many South Asian journalists are invited to China every year for different junkets, for training, etc. And even some Indian journalists go now and then. But clearly the effort is in trying to develop soft power or sharp power capacities in and around India's neighborhood. Now I see that until now, yes, Mr. Kannan Gopinathan is here. So which reminds me that for those of you who are interested in following Chinese media closely, one, of course, the ICS does a very interesting and important translation series helmed by Dr. Hemant Lakha. There is People's Daily Tracker run out of Takshashila Institution by Manoj Keburamani, does a regular translation of People's Daily articles, key articles in the People's Daily. There is at NIAS in Bangalore, again, sort of once in a while translation of Chinese media stories on India. But Mr. Gopinathan's new initiative, What China Reads, is actually quite interesting because it sort of uses technology to collate thousands of articles from different sources in China and uses machine translation to give you a sense of what goes on in terms of what the Chinese are reading. So I'd invite you to look at all of these sources as a way of understanding better what's going on inside the media space in China, and perhaps add to our excellent presentation by Ritusha today. So thank you, Ritusha, and let me thank also the Institute of Chinese Studies for this invitation and for organizing this particular Wednesday seminar. And I hope all of you will continue joining the ICS at its regular Wednesday seminars.